anybody who has assumed a leadership role of some sort knows that with that comes people who will criticize what you do. It's not just leaders who are criticized. I'm sure that every one of us at one time or another has been the target of criticism, whether under a leadership role or not. I know for myself that I've been at both ends. I've been the criticizer, and I've also been the one who has received the criticism. Sometimes criticism is deserved, but then other times we feel that it was absolutely wrong or unfair. The important question this morning is, when we are criticized, how do we respond to that criticism? Especially, how do we handle criticism that is destructive and not constructive? I don't know if you're familiar with the book of Nehemiah, if you've ever had a chance to read it, but it's filled with criticism. That was just an example out of the chapter. Just a quick summary up to chapter 4. Nehemiah was organizing a group of people to build a wall around Jerusalem, and this wall around Jerusalem was very, very large, and he was assigned to just one section of the wall. God had called him to the task, and now he was getting ready to start working on the wall. And I'm just going to specifically focus just on chapter 4. So, as we read in just verse 1, opposition is already starting to arise. We read, when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he exploded in anger, vilifying the Jews. That's kind of, I think, kind of a harsh reaction. Sanballat should have been pleased about the rebuilding of the wall. After all, there's nothing attractive about a pile of rubble. You would think that he would say, Nehemiah, I'm really glad you've come here to rebuild the wall and remove this eyesore. But he didn't react that way at all. As the construction started, he became very angry and he mocked the Jews. Why? Why was he so opposed to Nehemiah rebuilding the wall? Maybe he felt threatened by the changes that were going on. It could be as long as the Jews were weak and as long as Jerusalem was in ruins, as long as the wall was down, Sanballat felt secure. No one would be strong enough to defy his wishes and his plans. But once the Jews were united, once the wall was rebuilt, once Jerusalem was strong and secure again, Sanballat would lose his power over them. So the wall started backing up again. It was a threatening situation to Sanballat, and he couldn't deal with that threat. So he became angry. I don't want the wall up. I don't want it to stay the way that it is. There is something secure about the status quo, isn't there? Someone once said that status quo is Latin for the mess we are in. That might be a pretty good definition. In any organization, those who are most critical of change are the ones who are the most inflexible. They like status quo because everything stays the same, and that is exactly what Sanballat wanted. A poet wrote, of all the words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these 4 words. It might have been. But might I suggest that in the church, among the saddest of words that you'll ever hear are these: we have always done it this way. Have you ever heard anybody say that? Have you ever said that? I'm not talking about changing anything that is taught clearly in God's Word. I believe with all my heart that Jesus is the same today, yesterday, tomorrow, and forever. And that his word and his will for the church has not changed. But I'm suggesting, that God expects his church to grow. He expects his church to be winning people to Christ and helping them grow as Christians. The church must be reaching out and seeking to attract people to Jesus. A congregation full of Sanballats will never transform the world. A congregation full of Sanballats will die, and sometimes they don't even know why it's happening. We must never let that happen here. If it means doing some things differently than we have ever done before, then do it. Don't ever be one who follows in the footsteps of Sanballat and his crowd. For Sanballat did the same things that all critics do. Once he became angry, he started criticizing and went out for reinforcements. Verse 2 says, "In the company of his Samaritan cronies and military, he let loose and said, 'What are these miserable Jews doing? Do they think they can get everything back to normal overnight, make building stones out of make-believe?'" Do you see what he's doing? He is criticizing the work of Nehemiah and the people of God to others. Critics are never comfortable alone. When they begin to criticize, they eagerly seek someone else to agree with them. The critic will search for someone to listen to his criticism. Then the person will add their criticism. They egg each other on, and the first thing you know, there will be a whole circle of critics, because critics love other critics. That is exactly what happened here. Sanballat voices his criticism, and then Tobiah joins in. Listen to verse 3 again. At his side, Tobiah, the Ammonite, jumped in and said, "That's right. What do they think they're building? Why, if a fox climbed that wall, it would fall to pieces under his weight." I believe that portrays in one sentence the philosophy and spirits of most critics. Tobiah is saying, we may not be able to stop them from building, but don't worry, they'll never succeed. When critics can't stop something, almost inevitably the reaction is, well, they may not build it, they may do it, but it will never work, it will never last. And if by chance they prove to be right, you can bet that they will be the first to say, "I told you so." Did you notice, though, when Tobiah was putting in his 2 cents, he said their wall will fall down. It wasn't their wall that they were building, it was God's wall. God had commissioned Nehemiah to rebuild it. God had changed the mind of King Artaxerxes. God had instructed Nehemiah on how to build it. It was God's wall, and God's wall was going to be rebuilt no matter how many critics were opposed. Some criticism is constructive. Some criticism needs to be heard. I can tell you for me that I don't take constructive criticism very well, but over the years I've tried, when people give me constructive criticism, not to take it too personally, but it can be tough. Some criticism may even be of God, but this criticism was not, and therefore had to be dealt with. How did Nehemiah handle the criticism? Do you remember how he handled it? What did he do about it? The very first thing he did was he prayed to God. We should have expected that, because it's exactly what he had done before whenever he was faced with a difficult decision. Nehemiah doesn't even think of facing Sanballat and Tobiah and all the others until first he has sought God's direction and help. This was probably the hardest thing for him to do. By their nature, leaders want to fight back. Nehemiah probably wanted to punch Zerubbabel right in the face, but he knew that that would be a terrible mistake. So in his prayer, he says, "Oh, listen to us, dear God, we are despised. Boomerang their ridicule on their heads. Have their enemies cart them off as war trophies to a land of no return. Don't forgive their iniquity. Don't wipe away their sin. They've insulted the builders." It's kind of a different prayer. Usually when we read scripture, we're asking, forgive them. But Nehemiah doesn't say forgive them. Don't forget their sins. They have demoralized the people who are building the wall. Do you know what he's doing? He's fighting his battle on his knees. There's no time when we are stronger. There is no time when we advance more rapidly than when we are on our knees. Nehemiah is saying, "God, it is in your hands. Please fight the battle for me. And here are some suggestions. Don't forget their sins. Turn their insults back to them." And God did start fighting the battle for Nehemiah. It's interesting that God is fighting Nehemiah's battle for him, isn't it? Why would he do that? Do you remember the story of David and Goliath? Over here is the giant Goliath, and over here is David. And at the time, David's picking up the stones, and he's getting his sling ready. He's saying, "The battle is the Lord's. It's not mine." To Goliath, it made no sense at all. What is this puny little guy saying about the battle is the Lord's? But what about the time, smack right between the eyes? That was the end of Goliath, because the battle belonged to God, and God gave David the victory. What about Daniel? Daniel was commanded to pray only before the idols of King Darius. What did Daniel do? He went to his room and faced Jerusalem and prayed to Almighty God and dedicated the battle to him. And God delivered Daniel from the lion's den. What did Jesus do? The night he faced arrest and trials, and tomorrow the crucifixion, he went to the garden and poured out his heart in prayer. The next day he stood before his accusers, and despite everything they did to him, he didn't say a word. There was a preacher who had gone into a church that had a history of being fussy, and they fought all the time about everything. Everybody in the church was related. So I'm sure you can imagine the fights that they had. You couldn't say anything about anybody else without a fight. But do you know what the new preacher did? He loved them. That's what he did. He loved them. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but the harsh answer stirs up anger." We went in there and held their hands and prayed with them. He buried their dead, married their young. He cried with them and worked with them and laughed with them. And that church started to live again. Soon they were hugging each other and really acting like Christians ought to act in their fellowship with the Lord. They began reaching out to the community, and the church grew. The preacher had stayed there for about 10 years, had done wonderful things with the church, and he had to move on. And so then after he left, a new preacher came in, and he was a bit of an agitator. He was brilliant, graduated with honors, but he never learned the lesson of loving people. Guess what happened to that church? Every time an argument arose, he jumped right into the middle of it. Every time they disagreed, he clenched his fist and got into the middle and fought back. Within 6 months, he had destroyed nearly everything that had taken a decade to build, all because he didn't learn the lesson from Nehemiah. Maybe he should have read the book in Nehemiah. So when critics come, the first thing we must do is to go to God and seek his peace and retaliate with a gentle answer that will turn away the wrath. Criticism and arguments cannot survive alone. Did you notice after Nehemiah prayed, he went right back to work? He didn't stop construction and say, folks, we have a problem. There are all kinds of critics out there, so let's just shut her down and forget about it. No, he kept going and doing what he knew God wanted him to do. He kept on building the wall in all of Jerusalem. We kept at it, repairing and rebuilding the wall. The whole wall was soon joined together and halfway to its intended height because the people had a heart to work. That was verse 6. Now what happens next? Do the critics leave? Do they say, oh, we've been overwhelmed by their tenacity. There is nothing we can do, so we'll stop being so critical? No. Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repairs of the walls of Jerusalem were going so well, and that the breaks in the wall were being fixed. They were absolutely furious. They put their heads together and decided to fight against Jerusalem and create as much trouble as they could. We learn another great lesson from Nehemiah. Nehemiah always backed up his prayers with action. He exercised great common sense. Verse 9 goes on to say, we countered with prayer to our God and set around-the-clock guard against them. Nehemiah said they're getting ready to attack us. What are we going to do? Just pray to God? Not at all. Post a guard. Let's make sure we're prepared for their attack. Nehemiah wanted a wall built, so did God. He not only prayed about it, he made sure the guard was there and kept on building the wall. Teddy Roosevelt once said this, it's not the critic who counts. It's not the man who points out how strong the man stumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives violently, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even through checkered by failure, than to rank with those poor spirits who neither enjoy nor suffer much because they lived in a great twilight that knows neither victory nor defeat. I pray that you will never be part of Sanballat or Tobiah's crowd. Don't be quick to criticize. Don't be quick to point your finger at those who are trying to run the race and do the job. If you find yourself that you feel that you're being criticized, pray. The most powerful fight that you can fight is on your knees. The world is full of those who will stand back and say, why, a fox could jump on it and it will fall down. But it takes a special person to keep picking up one stone after another and keep putting it on the wall. Anybody can be a critic. But I ask you this morning, are you willing to enter the arena and build a wall for the glory of God? If so, this is your invitation.